Chinese state media mentioned such settlement between Ottawa and Michael is the indication proving Michael indeed engaged in espionage activities in China. This seems to be contradictory to Canada's narrative saying that Michael's detention were arbitrary and unjust. So can I have your response to this?
The Chinese government arrested and arbitrarily detained 2 Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, for political reasons. There was absolutely no justification, no reason, no excuse for them to do that. And we have stood strong from the very first day in support of the 2 Michaels and gathering together supporters from around the world, countries around the world who called out the Chinese government for its arbitrary detention of 2 innocent Canadian citizens. The fact that the Chinese government thinks that because we actually believe in supporting and taking care of citizens who go through hardship as somehow proof for letting them off the hook just demonstrates the depths to which China does not understand what it is to be a rule of law country that takes care of its citizens.
But I thought you liked China.
Any follow-ups? No. Okay.
Next question goes to CBC.
If you can answer in English and French, please. Prime Minister Trudeau, will you be restoring funding to UNRWA?
The ongoing humanitarian crisis and disaster in Gaza is heart-wrenching for everyone. We know how important it is to get aid into Gaza to help families, the innocents, the civilians, the people who have been devastated by the past few months, facing starvation, facing instability and uncertainty. We know we need to continue
I'm yawning
to be
listening
there
to this
for
guy.
them. At the same time, there are serious allegations being followed up by the United Nations, and we're going to continue to move thoughtfully forward, but our priority will always be being there to protect innocent lives. La réalité, c'est que
Feel out of step with the Canadian public, which is growing increasingly worried about the state of the forces.
I think the Canadians know we're living in a world that is far more uncertain and insecure than it's been before. You just need to turn on the news to see geopolitical instability all around you. And Canadians understand that not only do we have a responsibility to keep our own country safe, but we have much to contribute to keep the world safe and therefore keep Canada safe as well. These are things that we have stepped up on, unlike the previous Conservative government that actually dropped military funding down below 1%. We have steadily increased military funding with a plan to increase spending about 70%.
How could you not just go to sleep listening to this guy?
Including with the modernization of NORAD, announced a number of months ago, with real investments that are going to keep Canadians safe and ensure that the women and men of the Canadian forces have the equipment that they need.
That's why you're under 2% GDP for NATO.
The settlement with Michael Spavor did you also reach a settlement with Michael Kovrig, and can you provide any details of that?
I'm not going to get into these matters in terms of because of confidentiality issues, but of course Canada has been there to fight for the 2 Michaels' freedom, and we will be there as they rebuild their lives.
Okay, thank you. And can you comment about some of the protests that we've been seeing across the country in relation to the Israel-Hamas war, but particularly in Toronto? I mean, you had experience with this last weekend where your event was cancelled, and a lot of people were upset about that, upset how they've been, Toronto Police has talked about the hostility and confrontation between police and protesters now. What specifically is your government, if anything, going to do about this, or are these protests just allowed to happen in our country because it's a free country?
Well, first of all, nobody can remain indifferent to the suffering and the anguish going on in Gaza right now, this loss of civilian lives and the impact on Canadian families and people who are worried about their loved ones is entirely understandable. Canadians have a right to protest, absolutely, to make their anguish, their anger heard by other Canadians. That's important, and we will always protect that right. But when the protests turn to hatred or to acts of harassment, particularly against fellow Canadians, there's a line that's crossed. I've heard from too many members of the Jewish community particularly who are seeing their synagogues, their community centers, their neighborhoods protested, who feel unsafe in their own country. I know Canadians have very strong feelings about this conflict, and rightly so. There are horrible things that we are seeing. But it is not who we are to take it out on our fellow Canadians. Absolutely, there are things to be outraged about, things that people need to continue to protest about. But hateful or harassing behavior, particularly against neighbors, is not what we do here in Canada. And as that happens, or when that happens, I expect Canadians, including our police authorities, to act within the rules and within the law of making sure that everyone can always feel safe everywhere in this country.
Last question goes to CP.
Hi, Prime Minister. Just to clarify, since you mentioned before moving forward thoughtfully on UNRWA, can you confirm yes or no whether funding will be resumed to the organization? And if so, what has changed since last month when your government announced a pause on that funding?
We have ministers right now in the Middle East engaging on the ground with partners, looking at all the things that Canada can do and should do. We've been talking about airlifts lately. We need to get more aid into Gaza. We all recognize that. We're not making any announcements today, but we will continue to make sure Canada does the right thing in this situation and puts the protection of civilian life at the forefront of everything we do.
Follow-up?
Given Israel has accused UNRWA of having a dozen employees who participated in the October 7th attacks, would any future funding from Canada to the organization be tied to conditions or reform?
When we began our investments in UNRWA after a previous government had suspended them, we put in significant conditions and assurances about where and how that funding was to be used. We will continue to ensure that the funding, any funding we get on humanitarian issues anywhere around the world is used to protect the most vulnerable. We will continue to look at this situation. We will continue to watch the UN as it looks into what's happening within this organization.